Linton, the editor of my local paper, the Yorkshire Evening Press, Robert Beaumont, the chief features writer, and by more than 12,000 other of my constituents and people of neighbouring areas. I'd like to present the petition, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Hugh Bailey.
All right. Advertise it. Go ahead with the adjournment now, please.
Madam Speaker, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is, this House do now adjourn? Mr. Barry Field.
Madam Speaker, may I first of all thank you for granting me this adjournment debate this evening. And may I say how very rude health you appear to be. Clearly the Easter recess has done you well. This is the first occasion since my arrival in this House that I've ever had an adjournment debate on a national issue. Hitherto, all my adjournment debates have been exclusive to my constituency, the Isle of Wight. I have two admissions to make in the commencement of this adjournment debate tonight, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The first is that arachnoiditis, I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of it until it was raised locally in my constituency by the chairman of the Arachnoiditis Self Help Group. I believe I was in good company in that because none of the journalists on the local television, radio or newspapers had heard of it either. I understand it's the inflammation of the delicate membrane surrounding the spine and nerve roots, and it becomes inflamed, thickens and adheres to other tissues such as nerves. The condition has been associated with spine infections or injuries including spinal surgery, the most common of which is for slipped discs. It is allegedly caused by injections to the spine for such things as myelographies. I think the way in which it was particularly drawn to our attention, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was the fact that the Isle of Wight consultant who's responsible for these myelographies actually told our local newspaper that he wouldn't dream of having one of these himself, and because of the risks involved. And I think that particularly drew it to my attention and a number of others. The second admission I have to make, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that until I myself put my back out, fortunately only on one occasion, I didn't realise the sheer unspeakable agony of a back complaint. There is no respite from it, whether one is stood up, or tries lying down on a bed, or even on a hard surface such as a floor. I see my honourable friend, the Minister, is in his place and is in his usual rude health. I don't know whether he's ever suffered from a back complaint. I've noticed since his translation from the Whip's office, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that he's developed red box stoop. But apart from that, he always seemed to me a very bouncy and healthy minister. But if he, like myself, has had this unfortunate occurrence of putting one's back out, he will know precisely why I am taking part in this debate tonight and why I called for it. I must first of all pay tribute to my constituent, Mr. Ron Sheppard, who is the chairman of the Arachnoiditis Self Help Group. He has worked tirelessly for this cause, and his breakthrough came with my noble friend the Baroness Cumberledge's letter of the 5th of March when she wrote to me. And I'd like to, if I may, with your permission, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just quote from that letter in two occasions tonight. It is possible that any procedure involving puncturing the membrane around the spinal cord could lead to the introduction of harmful bacteria and hence cause inflammation such as arachnoiditis. And I must thank her, through my honourable friend, for cutting right through all the red tape and bureaucracy and giving this brave little band of back sufferers the answer straight down the line. A triumph, if I may say so, for open government. Now, the first great concern is that people are still feeling that they're not properly counselled as to the risks involved. Indeed, in her letter, she goes on, in many situations, MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging, will be a suitable alternative to a myelogram. Currently, clinicians have to consider for individual patients the balance between the risks of myelography and the risks of waiting for the availability of an MRI scan. The patient should be involved in this decision through informed consent. However, I have, as the Self Help Group has, a great number of letters from all over the country stating that they were never properly counselled as to the risks involved. I've asked the Chairman to select a brief sample just to illustrate the point tonight, and I'm sure my honourable friend will take my word for it that one could provide the originals and many more of them. But if I just quote, the first, of course, naturally from the Chairman himself, Ron Sheppard, "I was never warned of any risk before myelography." From Mrs. Rogers of Sussex, "At no time was I warned there may be side effects." Mrs. Ince of London, "Never at any point was I informed of the dangers of the said procedure." And Mrs. Peyton of Cornwall, "No one seems to tell you anything." Now, it has been put to me, and I'm sure my honourable friend, the Minister, will be sympathetic to this point, that when you're suffering the unspeakable and excruciating agony of this back disorder, you will effectively sign your life away to anyone who will promise you relief from it. And I do hope that my honourable friend will take on board this specific point this evening, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and that perhaps as a result of this adjournment debate tonight, we might in future see the introduction of a large, bold, typeface warning about the risks involved in this type of treatment, which is signed in duplicate by the patients, perhaps one being taken away with them and the other going on their file, so that in future there can be absolutely no doubt whatsoever that they have been properly counselled in these circumstances. Now, as the noble Minister mentions in her letter, MRI scans have an important part to play in the alternative therapy that will be available in the future. And I understand that the Royal College of Radiologists in September 1992 issued a report which they brought personally to the attention of the Secretary of State for Health, estimating that the MRI scanner needs of the United Kingdom are approximately 225, and that currently there are 90 in operation. And I'm very pleased to say that we have one that is made available on the Isle of Wight on a regular basis, and this plays an important part in the diagnostic health care of my constituents. My honourable friend, when he comes to respond to this debate, will no doubt point out to me that in 1991 the Secretary of State for Health announced a 3-year rolling programme for MRI scanners. But the fact is that this is an urgent problem, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and one of the reasons for this debate is to call for an accelerated programme. Indeed, with fund holding, these matters are being actively discussed with consultants and GPs throughout the country. In my own constituency, Mr. Paul Bingham of the Isle of Wight Health Commission has published in the Public Health Quarterly on the island an article to provoke discussion on the use of MRI scanners in the future. And today the Times tells me that my honourable friend will next week announce an increase in the limits for regions and National Health Service trusts from 50,000 to 250,000 for leasing medical equipment and building new developments. Having spent my first Parliament here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, campaigning against the wretched Ryrie rules, I am delighted that in the Prime Minister I have found a champion for their total abolition at long last. Next week's announcement, if the article be true, will hopefully be the manifestation of that abolition. But I want my honourable friend to go further. I think an area of great success in the government has been the provision of £1 for £1. For every £1 raised locally, it is matched by £1 from the taxpayer's pocket. Such a scheme for MRI scanners would, I think, be very welcome by the general public. I believe that many district health authorities already operate such a scheme, but to have it encouraged by the Department of Health, I think would be a very welcome initiative. For we can all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, decide what good causes we support, but none of us ever has the choice as to when we are ill. And that is why our National Health Service is so precious to us all. I hope my honourable friend will take this baton up and run with it until we have a result. I believe that such a scheme would not only accelerate the introduction of this wonderful tomorrow's world type of technology throughout the health service, would be just the sort of dynamic challenge the Secretary of State for Health had in mind in involving private financing in the health service. The other points I would like to ask my honourable friend is, are there any central records of the number of myelograms still being carried out, and what more can be done to ensure GPs are aware of arachnoiditis and ensure its proper diagnosis? Are there any proposals for looking at alternative pain management to avoid spinal injections? And has my honourable friend's department considered the work of Professor Jason at Manchester Hospital, who has been researching this condition and is president for the Self Help Group? And has the Medical Research Council a part to play in looking at this problem? Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I understand from Ron Sheppard that he has written to the Select Committee on Health asking them if this whole problem could be looked into. I know my honourable friend will, as always, be as helpful as possible in replying to this debate, and will do his best to continue that ray of hope that was brought into the lives of so many sufferers by our noble friend, the Baroness Cumberledge, in her letter. And I hope my small contribution tonight will encourage those who have suffered for so long, and that I may have convinced my honourable friend that arachnoiditis really is a pain in the back.
Tom Sackville.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I start by congratulating my honourable friend for his very full and lucid account of the very serious problems faced by people who suffer from arachnoiditis, and I acknowledge the very close interest he has taken in this matter. I am only too familiar with the problems of people with arachnoiditis. I've been made aware by my own constituents and through the department of just how great the suffering can be. Perhaps it would, however, be helpful to honourable members if I briefly describe it. It is an uncommon condition characterized by chronic inflammation and thickening of the subarachnoid space, which covers and protects the brain and spinal cord. It may develop for a number of reasons. These include meningitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage, tumours, trauma from injury or surgery, and irritants, including the contrast agents used in myelography. The condition traps nerves as they leave the spinal cord. Arachnoiditis at the lower end of the spinal canal may cause a great deal of low back and leg pain, although there is no distinctive syndrome. Any trauma to the spine, including surgical invasive procedures, may lead in some cases to the development of arachnoiditis. Patients with this condition may have more than one predisposing cause. For example, myelography involves trauma to the spinal cavity to introduce a needle through which a contrast medium, which is an irritant, is injected, and it is not uncommonly followed by a spine operation. Epidural injections involve the introduction of a needle to the epidural space. It does not penetrate the arachnoid membrane, nor is a contrast agent injected, but arachnoiditis has been reported following epidural injections. Myelography, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a diagnostic procedure. It involves the introduction of a contrast medium into the spinal column through a needle inserted into the lower spine. Once the contrast agent has been injected, several radiographs are then taken which provide views of the spinal cavity. Myodil was the UK trade name for the contrast medium, which was an oily contrast agent for myelograms introduced in 1941. It quickly became the standard contrast medium for myelography until the general acceptance of non-ionic water-soluble contrast media during the 1980s. Myodil has not been marketed since 1987, when it was withdrawn from the market by its manufacturers. It was first marketed in the 1940s and was therefore issued a product license of right when the licensing of medicinal products was introduced under the Medicines Act 1968. At the time of first licensing, the product information warned of the occurrence of post-myelography arachnoiditis in some patients. At the time of the review of the product license of right, this warning was strengthened. It is, of course, the responsibility of doctors who use a product to ensure that they are fully familiar with the benefits and risks of any procedure or treatment. Potentially any medicine may cause side effects, which may be minor or may be serious. The Committee on Safety of Medicines carefully monitors all issues of drug safety and, where necessary, provides advice to doctors, dentists and pharmacists. Prescribing information and advice about side effects is available to doctors in the data sheets of an individual product issued by the manufacturer of the product and in the British National Formulary, which the department provides to all prescribers. The incidence of clinically significant arachnoiditis associated with myodil myelography is difficult to assess, but has been estimated to be approximately 1%. However, the relative contribution of myodil compared to other factors also known to be associated with arachnoiditis is less certain. I am aware that legal proceedings are currently in progress between a substantial number of patients who claim to have suffered damage as a result of the use of myodil and Glaxo, the manufacturers of this product. The department, in this case the Medicines Control Agency, complied with a High Court order for discovery of documents related to myodil in 1991, but has had no further involvement in the case. My honourable friend will understand that in view of your judicial proceedings, I'm unable to comment further. Indeed.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way and the Honourable Gentleman for Isle of Wight for allowing this short intervention. On behalf of myself and the Honourable Member for Rochdale, who's the Liberal Party spokesperson on health matters. And it's interesting, in an adjournment debate, that all three major parties in the House are represented by their front-bench spokespersons in this. And the reason for this, of course, is that we've received literally hundreds of letters from the sufferers of arachnoiditis about both the pain they're suffering and the inability to get adequate answers to the issues that have been raised. I wrote to the Secretary of State on the 25th of March on behalf of honourable members on all sides of the House about a meeting in the department with the Honourable Gentleman and herself, with members from all sides of the House and the representatives of the Action Group, to see if we could consider in detail some of the complaints they're raising about the department. As of yet, I've had no confirmation from the department about an agreement in principle to this meeting. Perhaps the Minister could give an indication tonight before the end of this debate whether they, in principle, have agreed to the meeting, and secondly, when it's likely to take place.
Certainly give the Honourable Gentleman and the Honourable Lady an assurance that we will arrange a meeting at a time of their convenience. I will now make some general comments, if I may, about injuries sustained as a result of medical treatment. If a patient suffers injury as a result of medical treatment, he or she can go to court to claim compensation. If the claim is against the NHS, to be successful, the patient must succeed in proving that there has been negligence on the part of the NHS. Where a patient suffers an injury as a result of negligent care or treatment provided by the NHS, then it is right that compensation should be paid to that patient. However, the individual who is accused of being negligent also has the right to defend his or her professional reputation. Unless the alleged negligent action is so obvious as to be beyond doubt, then, as in other walks of life, if the injured person wishes to pursue the case, the dispute is resolved through the courts. In a case such as that concerning myodil, the government's position has always been that it is a matter to be resolved between the drug companies and individuals, if necessary, through the courts. May I turn now to magnetic resonance imaging, known as MRI, which is a relatively new method of imaging which has come into clinical use over the last 10 years. It is a non-invasive technique which enables good images of the spinal cavity to be obtained, but differs from myelography in not using ionizing radiation. In many situations, MRI will be a suitable alternative to a myelogram, but there will be some situations in which myelography is preferable. For example, some patients who are unable to tolerate enclosed conditions, which are a feature of MRI. Currently, there are around 78, and that number has already grown, as the honourable member has reminded me, in England, but this is not sufficient to take on the present myelography workload. So it would not be practical to discontinue myelography entirely. But I'm very glad to remind my honourable friend that the then Secretary of State for Health, as he acknowledged, announced early in 1992 a 3-year programme of capital funding for medical equipment, including whole-body scanners. A number of scanners were purchased in 1992-3, and we expect that rather more will be acquired in the current financial year. Clinicians associated with treatment of the spine would wish to avoid invasive procedures wherever possible, and consultants would not go along with it if there were always alternatives available. In the context of the current provision of our MRI, clinicians have to consider for individual patients the balance between the risks of myelography and the risks of waiting for the availability of an MRI scan. The patient should be involved in this decision through the process of securing informed consent. Patients are, of course, entitled to receive sufficient information in a way that they can understand about the proposed management, any possible alternatives, and any substantial risks. Patients must then be allowed to decide whether they agree to the treatment. This is an important principle of achieving informed consent, which has been highlighted in the patient's charter. But the points my honourable friend made about knowledge and consent are well taken. As part of the recent reforms, hospitals are responsible for providing efficient and effective health services to meet the needs identified by health authorities. In this context, and against the background of the imperative to minimize doses of ionizing radiation in diagnostic radiology, provider units will decide whether they will make MRI available. Conversely, health authorities as purchasers of healthcare will decide how best to use their resources in order to meet the needs of their population. If purchasers are not willing to purchase myelography, it is open to hospitals to provide MRI as an alternative. It is a sad fact that many people have been seriously affected by arachnoiditis, the exact causes of which are not always certain in individual cases. But there is, and this is another sad fact, no known cure for arachnoiditis, which can result in very severe pain. Adequate pain relief should be an important part of any treatment. Services specifically for the relief of pain are available in a number of hospitals. But if I may summarize, any invasive procedure in the spine carries a risk of causing arachnoiditis. Myelography is one such procedure, but the alternative, namely MRI, is becoming increasingly available. MRI can replace many invasive diagnostic procedures, including myelography, with the added advantages of avoiding ionizing radiation. We should remember, perhaps, that CT scanners were introduced about a decade before MRI and are now readily accessible. And I would hope very much that MRI will become similarly more accessible in the future. I would like to conclude by congratulating my honourable friend in the way he began his speech, in highlighting the problem and making more people familiar with the word. I take his point that warnings must be issued. People must be made aware of the degree of risk, which is uncertain, but it exists, and patients must be made aware of it. When I started replying to letters on this subject, I have to say that as a sufferer of back pain, though perhaps not a very severe back pain myself, I realized how enormously distressing this is. This is a problem which can dominate some people's lives, indeed ruin people's lives. So I hope that the program of acquiring MRI scanners will indeed accelerate, that hospitals will, as my honourable friend has said, take advantage of new flexibility in how they finance such acquisitions. I very much hope that this growth of MRI scanners will avoid more people suffering this very, very distressing condition in the future. And once again, I congratulate my honourable friend for bringing it to the attention of the House.
Is that this House will now adjourn. As many of the pen say aye, if they continue, I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.